So Kyle Rittenhouse, he's not a Bond villain, right? Like, he's an indeterminate joiner. He just kind of joined the team that made him feel like the most relevant. Like, it was like I was watching Ralph from The Simpsons on trial. We need to be honest about, there's a problem in the white church and the white family that keeps reproducing rather consistently, like this quality of anxious male who shoots people.
I don't agree that there's like this racial consciousness among white people that's making them very violent. In fact, I find it to be kind of a racist theory. You know, it's too much to put it all on like one person, right? It's too much to put it all on like
17-year-olds.
Yeah, all on him, or it's too much to put it on the three guys that he shot. All of whom seem to be much worse violent criminals than Kyle Rittenhouse, I should say.
Are you afraid at all that talking about white people in this way only shores up that sense of identity, which is exactly what actual white nationalists actually want? I think that if we did subscribe to a kind of maximalist view of what white supremacy is, then I think it would be very easy to accurately describe a lot of things as white supremacy. Like if you think that, you know, we live in a structurally racist society where the laws are written by one group to advantage themselves, affluent, landowning whites, that of course there are all these trickle-down effects over the years, many of which are not so trickled down as intentionally designed to have the very effects that they're having. And of course, we live in a white supremacist country and everything is white supremacist. But Zaid, you seem to be challenging that framing in your article. And I want to go back a little bit because the reason this particular conversation really sparked off was that in one of his campaign ads, Joe Biden discussed Donald Trump's unwillingness to condemn white supremacy. And one of the photographs that was used in that campaign ad in a montage of white supremacy, as it were, was a photo of Kyle Rittenhouse, which has now been raised again by people who are, you know, defending Rittenhouse or at least questioning the popular media narrative about Rittenhouse to say this was a premature descriptor to attach to him. And in fact, Jen Psaki was recently asked about this at a press conference. What do you make of that?
I don't know if Biden's campaign really meant to label him personally as a white supremacist, but they included him in like a clip reel of other people who sort of did fit that. Because the wider theme was about Trump, right? So I think that what's happening is people are suggesting that he himself was labeled that way, which, you know, like there really isn't any evidence of that. I mean, if you really just want to stretch it out, you could argue it, I guess, just because you can argue anything. But yeah, he himself, you know, is not in the same category as like an Anders Breivik or a Dylan Roof or, you know, you can name, there have been certainly people who have committed hate crimes and acts of terrorism in the name of that. It's just false. Like, it just happens to not be true. And I don't think that even Psaki or Biden have said it since. I think it was just a matter of them throwing together a campaign video quickly. And they're probably a little bit sloppy because I'm pretty sure Psaki didn't defend that allegation.
No, she said she wasn't going to talk about it at an ongoing trial. Irami, do you think that is a label that was inaccurately applied, knowing what we know now about Kyle Rittenhouse?
I mean, I think he effectively went to project a quality of terror that's like, you know, if white supremacy has a terroristic aspect that like other people are supposed to feel a certain way about his presence at that event, then yeah, I mean, I think it's an effective, look, I think we live in a country of like, don't poke the bear racism. And Kyle Rittenhouse is the bear. When I say don't poke the bear, it's like I said before, the whites are very fragile, but they run an orderly little country. So as long as you like allow them to run their little orderly country, they'll be fine. But if you poke the bear, you're going to get a Kyle Rittenhouse. And that is the kind of like, that's the water in which at least I swim in. And I'm not the own because I have family and they say the same thing that like, you know, the whites are fine. Just don't get them angry.
Can you like, explain what you mean by that a little bit more specifically? What do you mean by the whites won the whites run an orderly country so long as you don't put there? Are you saying that we all know that it's white supremacist, but we're willing to acquiesce to it, and basically as long as the rules are sufficiently fair for non-whites to live their lives? Yes,
I'm saying that. As long as they're sufficiently fair, which for the most part they are. And like I said, if you kind of get a little bit too high in front of your skis, or your eyes get bigger than your stomach and you start beating them in too many ways, they're going to cheat, but we're supposed to allow them and pretend like it's not. Like I said, you haven't heard a lot of people say that that removing the SAT was actually anti-Asian and pro-white. But I went to a UC school, so I know what it was. And I think not everyone, but a good number of people understand that to be their American experience, and they might be fine with it because for the most part, as long as you don't put their failure in their face, if and when you decide to beat them and you make them feel a certain way of comfort, they'll keep this country moderately, orderly. And that is kind of a horrible bargain we've made with the whites. And I'm not a huge fan of that bargain, but we have to understand that if we actually call that bargain what it is, it's going to provoke a quality of anxiety that's going to lead to more Kyle Rittenhouses. And we need to accept that as part of our civic duty to provoke that anxiety if that's what it means to get out, get out of this culture, which I think is like low-grade terrorism.
So what you're saying is, and I think we agree on this, that calling things white supremacy, calling out white supremacy is going to provoke people. They don't like to hear it. It's going to provoke people. And what you just said is that it might even provoke more Kyle Rittenhouses. But that's an argument for doing it more because ultimately you just got to suss out the devil.
Well, yeah, we have to suss out the devil, and we have to create a better white culture, right? Like Moynihan in the 70s didn't have any deep problems with saying that the problem is the black family and this cultural deficit. Well, we need to be honest about there's a problem in the white church and the white family that keeps reproducing rather consistently this quality of anxious male who shoots people or storms the Capitol. We need to actually figure out what's going on with the whites. We need to talk about the deficient family. I've heard this called toxic masculinity, but this guy had a very close relationship with his mother who brought this along. So what's going on in this kind of family? What's going on in the cultural institutions? Maybe if he had actually had a more rigorous CRT program in K through 8, he's not a murderer now. So we need to think about where his cultural deficit emerged and kind of plug the hole for the sake of, I think, the union. And it's going to bring up feelings and anxiety among the whites. And when the whites get anxious, they start shooting people. So it's going to bring up anxiety among other people too. But it might be the healthiest move for the nation if we're actually going to figure out how to make the nation whole in a way that we have yet to do so in 200 years.
Zaid, what do you make of that? And does the left have enough cultural power and political power to do what Irami is advocating for?
Do they have enough cultural and political power to...
Right, the polls being what they are, just seeing what they are for midterms, Biden and Harris, both with low favorability, the expectation that we're going to lose one or both houses, the CRT battle seemingly being lost in the cultural wars. Even if you agreed, and I want to ask you if you agree with what Irami is proposing here, I want, as a follow-up, to interrogate whether or not we'd even be successful in the effort to say, let's get Kyle Rittenhouse more CRT training and maybe we wouldn't have these outcomes. I
mean, I think you wouldn't have had the outcome if a bunch of hothead young kids weren't allowed to run around with guns. I mean, America has more guns than people, right? It's 350 per 320 or something million. I don't know the exact number, but that's probably what would have prevented it. I mean, I got in a lot of scrapes when I was a kid, but for the most part, we didn't have guns accessible. And I can imagine some of those scrapes would have ended up with someone getting shot if there were just guns around. Unfortunately, in America, everyone has one. And I don't have a practical solution to that because I think that trying to regulate guns in this country is very messy. The only gun laws that have been successful, when Rand Corporation studied them, were the ones that just prevent young children from getting them, making sure parents lock them up and stuff. And but trying to actually reduce the number of guns in this country has been a huge failure. Anytime it's been tried, it's really kind of sucks.
So you've written an article, though, Zaid, about the Rittenhouse trial bringing out the worst qualities in American politics and people kind of overusing, preemptively jumping to scripts about white supremacy and what was motivating people.
I mean, that's what political addicts do, man. They have their narrative and they transpose it onto everything. They're ignoring 99.9% of violence in the country to obsess about one racial group, like obsessive anti-Semites or something, right? This is what they're doing, right? And I'm trying to talk about how do we actually solve these acts of violence that I I interview people almost on a monthly basis who've lost their sons or daughters to gun violence. And like, that's what I'm thinking about. And gun violence doesn't have a color, doesn't have a political ideology. It's just like there are many different reasons why people would end up shooting each other.
Zaid, you've written that people jump to the conclusion of jumping to white supremacy when that was a motivating cause. So I'm asking you to respond to Irami's point here, which is, do you think
his point is much larger than the Rittenhouse shooting, right?
Well,
his point is more about the political and social structure, which I think is a legitimate debate. And I think Irami brought up a number of legitimate debates in that regard. But if you're asking me how you would prevent shootings like this,
No, that's not my question.
I don't understand what like making sure more like college level people throw out more like CRT language at each other. That's not going to prevent shooting, man. There's like how many shootings are there every weekend in Washington D.C.? Like, you know, you can go give them a college level class in critical theory or whatever. It's not going to do anything about that. What's going to do something about that is that there's very high level of gun access among a lot of desperate people and people with mental illness problems and people who don't know how to solve their conflicts any other way. I mean, the 3 people he shot, they were all just like terrible people. I wouldn't want to be anywhere near them. They're extremely violent people. I wouldn't want to be near Rittenhouse either, right? I wouldn't want to be near any of these people, but I don't think giving them a lecture about, the history of white supremacy is going to do anything about it. I think you have to be kind of a political fanatic to even believe something like that, honestly. Like, you don't live in the real world. I try to exist in the real world, not just on Twitter, man. And in the real world, there's these kinds of battles and shootings all over America all the time. This one happened to have a political backdrop because there was a riot and all kinds of crazy people get involved when there's a riot, including Jason Rosenbaum, a 6-time rapist who just got out of a mental hospital, right? I don't think he even cared about politics, to be honest with you. Kyle probably didn't care that much either. He just didn't like his town that his dad lived in getting burned down. I mean, that was the end of it. I don't agree with people shooting each other, but like that's what happened.
The question of whether or not we have a gun violence problem in America is not really what's on the table right now. I think we can all agree that we wish we had better gun laws and that it's a very difficult problem to address as a political metric. What Irami has raised is the specific question of what's motivating a certain kind of gun violence that arguably, and you can contest these statistics and have an argument about that, but arguably is on the rise. And why it is that we have a cultural investment, it seems, a growing cultural investment in a kind of vigilante political justice that's perhaps best represented by what happened on 1/6 and now subsequently Kyle Rittenhouse. And whether or not there's a cultural... I don't think those two things were
the same, though. I think the people on 1/6 were largely conspiracy theorists, right?
And that's completely fine to not think those things are the same. But here's the question that's been presented.
Briahna, it actually matters when I don't agree with the like thesis, right? I have to agree with the thesis before I can say how we talk about it, right? Or how we address it.
I don't agree with the thesis either, Zaid, actually. I'm just trying to get what Irami's argument is out on the table so that we can address
I'm just saying, like, the way that we address 1/6 is very different than the way we address gun violence. That's all I gotta say.
That's fine. However you want to characterize it.
And I agree with Irami, we need to address both things. But if I think that they're different things, we got to address each thing where it is, right? So that's all.
So the question being presented...
Thesis, I actually think they're the same thing.
That's fine. Irami, if I could just... I don't agree or disagree with either of you. I'm really trying to unpack these ideas. So please don't feel like I'm arguing with you. I'm just trying to make sure Irami made a point. I don't even agree with it, but I want to make sure it's being out there and that you're responding to it, Zaid, because you made an interesting point, but it was a point about how to get rid of gun violence in America, which is not what Irami was arguing. So I just want to make sure I want you to respond to Irami's point. I have no dog in this fight, but I want you to please respond to Irami's point about a rising
Briahna,
kind of specific
I am responding to it just by saying I don't agree that there's like this racial consciousness among white people that's making them very violent. In fact, I find it to be kind of a racist theory. I mean, that's just how I view the world, right? It might be irreconcilable, but that's my response to the point. If I want to address violence, I'm going to do it in what I think is a sensible way. I'm not going to adopt this like racist framework about how whites everywhere are getting really violent and shooting people when there's actually not that much gun violence of this political nature, right? It's mostly of the kind that I was describing, which is just that there's a high level of gun penetration among like angry young guys who have a lot of social and mental problems of all backgrounds.
Isn't the end of your sentence there conceding that there is this cultural, social aspect of angry young men who are lashing out in various ways, some of whom politicize it in one way or the other? But isn't that kind of going to the underlying point that there's something here other than just an abundance of guns?
I think that, you have to look at these cases of violence on a case-by-case basis. I don't think that there is like an underlying narrative that a through narrative between 1/6, Kenosha, Dylan Roof, et cetera,
El Paso.
Any more than I would think that a shooting that happened in West Baltimore is exactly the same as a shooting that happened in Dallas or Houston against police officers or anything like that. I think each case has to be looked at individually. And I don't think that there is just a big social framework other than the gun thing, which I do think is a big kind of large scale narrative that in America, whether we have interpersonal violence or political violence, it's going to involve guns just because we have so many, right? In the UK, a lot of this is just like people end up brawling, right? Or they just like have knives or something. And so that's the only reason I brought up the guns. I'm not trying to disrespect either of yours points or your moderation, Briahna.
Irami, what do you make of that? Because some people might argue that inner city violence in Baltimore and Nevada or Dallas, or a police shooting in Baltimore and Dallas also kind of share different sets of cultural realities in those places. What do you make of the idea that there isn't a growing cultural something happening here that may or may not have a relationship to white supremacy?
I mean, the shootings in Atlanta with the massage parlors, the El Paso shootings, I think it's all the same kind of anxiety about what white people do to keep their country as like they understand it should be. And I think that's part of what it is to be in America. I also think gang activity in New York, Baltimore, Oakland, Los Angeles, actually has a national problem, and it's not an accident that it's often in Chicago, it's often black people shooting black people. I think there's a national problem, and we haven't dealt with the social and now cultural aspects that kind of motivate that problem. So you can't just do it on a case by case basis because we're dealing with huge historical racialized degradations that are we created hot boxes. And it's not an accident. And I don't think it's a case-by-case basis. I think it's the same problem of a vague cultural anxiety about us not actually having the social and political policies that are adequate to participate in and govern a racially just society. Everywhere there's redlining, you'll find shooting. A history of you can't say that that's an accident, or you have to take these shootings on a case-by-case basis. No, they're all living in the quality of stress and external stress that was created by federal policies around race, and they're taking it out in similar ways because they all kind of came, the hot boxes were all designed at the same, for the same reason at the same time in the same nation. So we have a national problem, and I think the problem is a quality of racial entitlement that's then expressed in entitlement to a certain kind of education, entitlement to a certain kind of religious practice, a certain entitlement to a certain kind of understanding of the family that then all ends up, when you put together, they mutually reinforcing institutions that all end up being tantamount to black degradation. Right. So
can you help me unpack that a little bit, a little bit more? What do you mean that? Who are we talking about there when we're talking about all of these institutions building up?
So Kyle Rittenhouse, I only saw a bit of the trial, but he seemed like he's not a Bond villain, right? He's an indeterminate joiner, and he just kind of joined the team that made him feel like the most relevant, right? So it's kind of what Hannah Arendt said about Eichmann. The same, these bad guys are not particularly bad. They're just participating in a bad structure. It was I was watching Ralph from The Simpsons on trial. This guy is not some sort of super villain, but yet it takes a series of institutions actually to participate before you actually find this guy across state lines with a large weapon shooting people. We have to talk about the families that produced him, the schools that failed to produce him. He's a social failure. And at 17 years old, he's a youth. And we say that youths are not actually responsible for what they do. What they do is actually a reflection of who their minders are. So it's a reflection of us, right? So we need to actually do a real autopsy into all of the cultural institutions that created that moment. And I don't think it's responsible to disaggregate it from El Paso, to disaggregate it from the dude in Atlanta who's shooting up.
Wait, so every white person who commits an act of violence, I don't think that they're all a mass of people any more than any black person or any Jew or any Arab. But like, I don't think we can. It just comes across as a racist theory to me. I'm sorry. Like,
well, I want to ask you about why you think it's a racist theory. But I mean, first,
because it just obviously is. Like, it fits the actual definition that 99% of Americans who aren't in fringe corners of academia believe. Like,
Zaid. But first, I want to follow up on Irami's last point before we forget and move away from that part of the conversation.
Yeah.
Which is to ask.
No, I agree. I agree with what part of what Irami is saying.
Zaid, please, Zaid, just let me ask the question. We could have gotten past it.
I just want to say I do agree with some of what he's saying. That's all I'm saying.
Okay. Irami, I do want to follow up on what you said, because isn't that an argument, naming all those cultural factors, against it being an issue of white supremacy?
Oh, I think all of those cultural factors are like the content of white supremacy, right? So you can't just point at Rittenhouse and say he's a white supremacist when you actually like listen to Rittenhouse and you find out there's not a lot of there, right? So if he's like what a white supremacist is, we have to actually understand that he's a reflection of all of these other institutions when put together mutually reinforce a quality of racial hierarchy, which is tantamount to white supremacy, right? So
yeah, so I mean, this is the problem. This is the thing we get in. I had a guest on this show who called me a white supremacist or white supremacist adjacent because I didn't believe in their politics. And at a certain point, do we get to a place where the term, even if it's accurately applied, is meaningless because we're like fish in water describing the fact that we're wet?
I think I have an answer to that, right? So like there's going to be a problem with me and a lot of left politics, because I do think like in a deep way, if like a vaguely ethno-fascist government politician like supported universal health care, the left wouldn't really have the arguments to fight against it.
Agreed.
And that's a problem, right? that is a problem. And so like the idea that we're okay with a racial hierarchy as long as it delivers goodies and it seems to work in such a way that is short of self-governance and self-determination and might be a little bit high on like coddling racial anxiety of the whites, as long as it delivers goodies, is a form of white supremacy. And I think that's like a large part of the left.
And you're saying that's where we already are, basically. The goodies aren't great, but that's kind of the status quo we're in already.
The question is, and the people who want to get out of that status quo want more goodies by catering to white culture as it is, as opposed to, I'm saying that like we might need to like downgrade the goodies and go full board on changing the whites.
Well, I would object to the idea that people want more goodies exclusively by catering to white people. I think the overwhelming majority of people don't want that. But that's a different conversation. Zaid, I want to come back to your point about why you think what Irami's arguing here is fundamentally a racist point.
Well, I don't think the whole thing is. I did want to say I agree with some of what he has to say, which is that when he was describing that there are certain, it's too much to put it all on like one person, right? It's too much to put it all on like
a 17-year-old.
All on him, or it's too much to put it on the three guys that he shot, all of whom seem to be much worse violent criminals than Kyle Rittenhouse, I should say.
Does Anthony Huber have some
I believe he was a domestic
record?
Abuser.
I don't think that was Huber. I think that was
no, two of them were domestic abusers, and one of them was the child rapist. That's Jason Rosenbaum. But the other two were domestic abusers, which also brings up an interesting question. Why did domestic abusers have legal guns? Anyway, that's America for you. I do agree with that point. I just don't think that we can say that, like, okay, here's a problem with the whites. I feel like I'm reading a newspaper from the 1950s talking about African Americans in the South or something like, this is the problem with the blacks, right? Or this is the problem with the Jews in the Middle East. People are always talking about the Jews. Or in Lebanon, maybe Sunnis are trash talking the Shias and back and forth. I do agree that there are cultural pathologies that exist among certain people, but you can't really just generalize it by skin color, and you can't generalize it by ethnic group. It doesn't really make logical sense, right?
I mean, I think a cultural pathology goes down to property, right? So Kyle Rittenhouse goes to this rally to defend property. It's already a property fetish. He's willing to shoot people based on his, like, he took it upon himself to shoot people over property that wasn't strictly his. That already speaks to a quality of pathology that we've normalized in America because, like, Locke, right? So like property fetishism is a part of settler colonial like mentality, which is tantamount to white supremacy. So like we're dealing
if
with
you went to
property
Accra or Mumbai or Hong Kong and you tried to burn down someone's building or their house, they'd also probably shoot you. Like, it's not a white person
Yeah,
thing.
I tend to
like,
agree.
That goes back to like it reminding me of an anti-Semitic conspiracy theory, because you're like pathologizing an entire group of people, giving them special, unique characteristics, which are really just human characteristics. Now, I may agree with you that in many cases in America, we do fetishize property too much. In many places across the world, we probably do. But again, it's not really specific to this group of people.
It is a fetish insofar as it's a problem for other spheres of right. I think it's an artifact of settler colonialism, and I think it's articulated as such in political philosophy that was taken up by the founders, right? So like I think we were like founded as a settler colonial nation in this way, and this is what happens when we only think of one kind of right, property right. And then anything you do to defend property right becomes legitimized, I think it's a cultural pathology.
On that aspect of it, but the racialized aspect, I think, is what Zaid is maybe calling into question. That in America, our resource distribution is such that Black people don't have a ton of them. But I can easily imagine a world where some bourgeois Black is standing on their front lawn with a gun, saying protesters don't come over here, right? And it's your point about settler colonialism stands, but it's only racialized as a consequence of how our country is racialized, and not because there was some like cultural deficit or something. And the idea that it is white and somehow like a white cultural deficit, as I think what Zaid is pointing to, is something that sounds uncomfortable or racist.
I think it's uncomfortable. I think we've all just become like scared to talk about the cultural deficit that is like white institutions.
I'm not scared. I just don't agree. I mean, I'm fine with you saying it. I just don't agree. That's the issue. But I agree with you that like we shouldn't be scared to say things that we think are true, no matter what they are.
Well,
so I do agree with you on that.
Are you concerned at all? Like, I understand that there's something somewhat sort of like satisfying in a tit for tat way about having Black cultural pathology in quotation marks being held up as the justification for why we shouldn't be spending on social programs and why Black people kind of deserve their lot in life and we shouldn't be concerned about disparities and having all the bootstrap stuff and the Bill Cosby stuff, like to then flip it and say, actually, there's white culture pathology and we're just going to do even Stevens. I understand that there's something kind of that feels just about flipping the script in that way, but is it useful? Are we ultimately ever going to win that battle, or does it just justify white people, racist, whomever, doing the same thing to Black people, and because they have numbers and cultural hegemony, they're going to win?
Right. No, I think until we actually deal with the white family as a cultural institution and the white church as a cultural institution, it'll keep reproducing all of these like dynamics that may allow some progressive goodies every now and then to be spread around the people, but will always do so like in a contingent way that will ultimately like not actually share and distribute and democratize power. Like I think these institutions, the white family, the white church, and insofar as they work together in like controlling what we do in public schools, like I think we need to think about them as cultural institutions, as part of ethnic whiteness. And until we do so, we'll keep having this conversation. And until we do so, they'll keep producing the occasional Rittenhouse, and it will police non-white behavior. Because we know if we provoke the bear, if we step out in a certain way, there's going to be like this low level of violence. And not just because they're guns, the guns are a part of it, but because of white entitlement, racialized entitlement, that that the laws or the executive branch isn't really serious about tamping down. And we're not really serious about educating people out of either. Because, I don't know, for a variety of reasons, there are a lot of voters or they have a lot of money. And we just think that if we play nice with the whites, then life will be fine.
It sounds to me,
really.
In some ways, Irami, like you're doing, I don't know if you're familiar with, Racecraft, the Field Sisters book that says, and this came up somewhat in my recent conversation with Thomas Chatterton Williams, that in a certain way, continuing to talk about whiteness in this way that's become in vogue, white people as a group, not individual cultural identities, but this political, cultural, institutional group of whites, encourages them to identify as such in a way that would break a more productive political bond from the left's perspective over issues like class or even regional differences or other things that are a little bit less toxic in our current political environment. And are you afraid at all that talking about white people in this way only shores up that sense of identity, which, to Thomas Chatterton Williams's point, is exactly what actual white nationalists like Proud Boys and Richard Spencer and stuff actually want? Hey YouTube, thanks for watching. Just a reminder that this is a podcast. You can catch an extra premium episode every Monday for $5 a month at patreon.com/badfaithpodcast. That's patreon.com/badfaithpodcast for $5 a month, an extra episode every week. Additionally, please do consider liking this video, subscribing to this channel. It helps us out. It helps independent media beat the algorithm. We appreciate you. And as always, keep the faith.